some interesting comments here from Bob Arum. Now look, Bob Arum does talk a whole heap of rubbish, but occasionally he says something which is actually worth listening to and contemplating. So he said here, and he's talking about Dana White. Dana has been a very good promoter for UFC, but UFC is a monopoly. He tells the fighters who they are going to fight and when they are going to fight, and he pays them very little against what professional boxers get. So he's a monopolist, and it's not easy for a monopolist to go into a sport like boxing, which is anti-monopolist. We have very little barriers of entry in boxing, and we have a lot of promoters. Everybody is looking to promote for the best way they can for themselves. Dana White could not exist in that type of milieu. He can only exist in an avenue where he is the dominant monopolistic person, where he is manager, promoter, rules maker for the participants, everything. I'm telling you, there is something about the operation of the UFC which is a violation of a federal law. You cannot do that in boxing because of the Muhammad Ali Act, which, to reasons only known to White, doesn't apply to the UFC. Why? I don't know. The Muhammad Ali Act at least gives rights to the fighters, managers, and prevents a monopoly-like situation. So those are the words of the Bob father, Bob Arum. I think he makes some interesting points. I think that, yes, Dana White doesn't quite have a monopoly, but it's a near monopoly. I mean, UFC is by far and away the most prestigious mixed martial arts promotional company in the world. And I don't know if they were the first mixed martial arts promotional company, but they were certainly the first major one. They started in, was it the early 90s? Because I remember when UFC started. I remember back then all the strange characters who were appearing in UFC. And I remember the boxing magazines at the time talking about the UFC, and they were all scathing and mocking and, you know, whatever of UFC. I remember the controversy that it caused in the newspapers and the national press when UFC first started. And a lot of people thought it was a fad. They didn't think it would last long. So, yeah, UFC, not quite a monopoly, but I understand what Bob Arum's talking about. And Dana White does do all the things that Bob Arum says, pays the fighters very little, and dictates damn near everything. And I'm sure it's not just Dana White himself. There's other people high up in that organization who have a say in that too. But ultimately, it's not really the fighters who get to call the shots. It's people wearing suits who are not in the cage. So personally, I don't like that. I like fighters having a bit more independence and a bit more say, because I respect the fighters. I mean, I remember watching an interview, I think it was Tito Ortiz, on Vlad TV, and he was talking about how little he was paid for some of his biggest fights. To me, it's absolutely scandalous. It goes back to the days of when boxing was controlled by the mob and other organizations like that. Not to say that there's anything criminal about UFC, but I'm just talking about the way the fighters were treated. Like pieces of meat just thrown in there. You know, you fight and you'll take whatever money we give you. Whereas in boxing, look, some of that goes on in boxing still, but there's still an element of fighters, particularly the top level fighters, who have a lot more independence than UFC fighters do. I'm not saying they're totally independent and there's no influence over them, but it's not the same as UFC. They do have more leeway and they do have more say-so than your average UFC fighter, it would seem. So I take on board what Bob Arum says there, and I do agree with him. And when he says that Dana White wouldn't survive in the world of boxing, I agree with that too. Because he has a situation where he has by far and away the biggest MMA company, where the name UFC carries a certain weight which no other name in MMA does. Whereas in boxing, it's really not like that. It's not a monopolistic situation, and it's highly competitive. That's the main thing. And I guess that's what Bob Arum was getting to, is that boxing promotion is an extremely competitive business. would Dana White be able to survive in that type of competitive milieu where you've got all these powerful forces? You got Bob Arum, you got Eddie Hearn, you got Al Heyman. In the UK, of course, you got Frank Warren. You got the Sauerlands, you got the World Boxing Super Series, which is a promotional entity, in itself. So you've got a whole heap of different, promoters. You got different networks, which are also battling with each other. So it's a very, very competitive environment. Whereas in MMA, Dana White's kind of got it his own way. He doesn't really have to battle that hard against other organizations and other promoters and what have you. Maybe that's why he hasn't yet tried to take a foray into boxing. Maybe that's why, because he knows it's going to be a lot more difficult trying to get things started in the world of boxing than it is in MMA. He's going to have a lot more pushback. He's going to have a lot more competition. And in UFC, he's got, a hell of a lot of good fighters. And most of the top MMA fighters try and get into the UFC because it's seen as the most prestigious. I'm assuming they get paid the most there. Whereas in boxing, you get certain promoters like Eddie Hearn, who a lot of fighters go to, but then they go back to, some of them go back to Frank Warren. Some of them go over to Al Heyman. Some of them go to Bob Arum. Nobody has a monopoly on all the best talent, or a near monopoly on all the best talent in boxing. So could Dana White really come in and manage to suck up all the best talent in boxing? What's the incentive for fighters to want to sign with Dana White, given his UFC model? What would be the incentive for the best fighters to want to sign with Dana White, knowing what he pays his UFC guys, knowing the kind of model that he's been working with in UFC? If you was a Tyson Fury or an Anthony Joshua, would you want to sign with Dana White, or would you want to keep on doing exactly what you're doing, where you're your own boss, you're calling your own shots? Yeah, your promoters and networks are going to have some influence over you. Don't get it twisted. But you're not going to be told, okay, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're getting paid very little money. No, that's not going to be happening. Tyson Fury and AJ wouldn't accept that. So what would be the incentive to sign with Dana White? That's going to be his biggest problem, is convincing fighters, convincing boxers that they need to leave whoever they're with and sign with him. Because some boxers are not very business savvy. Some boxers are not really very clued up on what Dana White and the UFC are about. But plenty of them will be, and they will be looking at the way he's treated his fighters in UFC over the years and continues to do. So anyway, just some musings on Dana White and a possible foray into boxing. Now, Bob Arum, to be fair, has a bit of a history with Dana White that goes back a long time, because he's been very critical of MMA in general. I'm not going to repeat some of the comments because YouTube algorithms are very sensitive, but some of you guys know what I'm talking about. He's just been critical of MMA in general. He's been critical of the UFC crowd in terms of the demographics. Bob Arum has just said some very uncomplimentary things about MMA and UFC specifically. So that does have to be said. And, it is what it is. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's happening about. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.